When the Western Roman Empire fragmented, various cities were identified as seats of power. Milan was one, Ravenna was one, Aquileia to the north of Venice was one, and Venice was nothing. Venice was this little fishing village located on small marshy islands. So historically, Venice is really detached from Italy proper. It was not a Roman town. It does not have the detritus of Roman ruins scattered around. It does not have remnants of a Roman town plan with Cardo and Decumanus. It does not have even, land. Venice is not connected to the mainland. It's this artificial thing floating out in the middle of the Adriatic Sea. In order to build in Venice, they would bring in these 50-foot-long trees from Croatia because they have good trees there. And they had these methods of hammering them down to build up this new fortified ground plane upon which they could build their buildings. And they still do this nowadays. It's kind of amazing. There are 177 canals in the city with an overall length of 45 kilometers, with more than 400 bridges, complemented by the intricate network of streets and alleys. These constitute today an incomparable medieval urban landscape that has remained practically unchanged. The Grand Canal, with a length of more than 3 kilometers, is the only important waterway in Venice, with a maximum width of 70 meters and a minimum of 37, and along its course, it forms 3 sharp but majestic curves. There used to be a small piece of high ground over here, and the Rialto Bridge was built to connect these points. Its name comes from Rivo Alto, which means high ground or high banks, and historically until the 18th century that was the only bridge in Venice, and that's because in the Middle Ages Venetian citizens wouldn't go to the other side of the Grand Canal because they didn't need to. If they needed something, they could get it on their side of the Grand Canal. So the city was historically divided into really tight neighborhoods, and the charm is that it still is. So if you go to Venice, you might not enjoy it so much if you follow a tour guide route that gets you to the main attractions. You know, if you're in the road that says to Piazza San Marco, or to train station, or to Rialto. But if you get off that road, the charm of Venice is that it's such a tangled mess that nobody ventures out there. And then you find these wonderful little neighborhoods with little squares with cisterns and little cafes. But it is easy to get lost in Venice because of its organic layout. The fabric of Venice comes from water collecting rather than a gridded urban layout. Because it's out in the middle of salt water, they would have to collect rainwater. If you look at this plan, you will see all these little squares, all these little piazzas. And each piazza would have an underground cistern, so that when it rained, water would collect, and that became the water source. So you will see a well like this in every piazza of Venice, which functions as the lid of the cistern. In the Middle Ages, Venice wanted to become a city of greater prominence. It began to expand. It began to develop an arsenal that built great ships for sea travel, but also for warfare. Venice became an important port. But it was still nothing as a city because it didn't have a Roman past. It didn't have the imprimatur of ancient Rome. And it didn't have a major church. They needed to get some relics in order to establish the presence of an important church. This painting from the 1560s by Tintoretto, a Venetian painter, shows you this crusade that the Venetians mounted in the 9th century to go to Alexandria in Egypt, where Saint Mark the Evangelist was interred and still his body because it was an important relic. This is an apostle. If they could get the body of Saint Mark to Venice, then they would be able to establish a church and attract pilgrims. The status of the city would become not simply mercantile, but also important in terms of its Christian presence in the Christian pantheon. One of the most memorable spatial complexes in the history of urban planning, the Piazza di San Marco, or St. Mark's Square, actually consists of 2 interconnected squares. The piazza proper, located in front of St. Mark's Basilica, and the piazzetta that connects the complex with the sea. The freestanding campanile, or bell tower of St. Mark, is set in a relatively narrow space between the 2 plazas and acts as a perfectly placed hinge. And in terms of urbanism, this is called an interlocking space. You go to the second space without leaving the first space, because if you're standing here, your view escapes all the way to the other plaza. This site began to become the central focus of the city from the year 827, when the Chapel of St. Mark, originally a private chapel of the Doge or Duke, was transformed into a worthy sepulchre to house the body of St. Mark. The Doge's Palace, together with St. Mark Basilica, currently forms the eastern side of the piazza. The current character of the square dates back to the 15th and 16th centuries. In these years, the surrounding buildings were built, thus establishing the shape of the plaza, and the 3 flagpoles in front of the basilica were placed. The bell tower was rebuilt, as it used to be a wooden structure engaged to the surrounding buildings, and now is a freestanding brick building. The treatment of the paving tiles, which constitutes a vital element of compositional unification, was carried out in the 18th century. Now, to understand these buildings, we first need to understand the character of typical Venetian architecture. In Venice, you see this predilection for thin screened architecture. This is the Ca d'Oro, or Golden House, perhaps the most beautiful building in Venice. It's on the Grand Canal. You see a lot about what it is to build in Venice just by looking at its facade. Thin as paper. As I mentioned, there is no ground in Venice, so the only way to build anything is to drive timber piles into the ground. And bringing these timber piles to the city is expensive, so you have to be economical about where you put your foundations. So typically in Venice, the foundations go perpendicular to the canals. The result is that the stuff in between can dematerialize. The screen wall facing the canal has no structural value whatsoever. It's hung between these bearing walls, and so you get this dematerialization of surface that's really quite extraordinary. You can also see here how a Venetian house would have worked in the Middle Ages. There's a porch for arrival, but the porch is on the water, not on the land, so you come in by gondola. You get off and then you move through the house, so the face of the house is on the canal, and the house is porous and receptive to the water. It's also interesting in Venetian architecture to look at the rhythm of these facades. There's typically a grouping of windows towards the center of the facade, leaving the extremities comparatively solid, thus producing the effect of a central feature enclosed by wings. Also the ability to insist on centers. Here's a center, here's a center, here's a center. And then destabilize those centers so you get an unstable rhythm. You get local symmetries that dissolve and reconstitute themselves as more complex global symmetry. And Venetian facades constantly do that to you. I noticed the characteristic way the Venetian facade meets the sky with these little crenellated elements, somehow taking the way it meets the water and stylizing it so that there can be this equal unwrapping of lightness on both sides. Probably the most famous Venetian Gothic building is the Doge's Palace. The Doge is the Duke, the ruler. If you think about gravity and the weight of materials, it's an odd-looking building. We have a fairly massive wall in the upper part, and then down below we have these spindly columns that seem to rise out of the ground having no bases. Kind of an anti-gravity building, or at least a building that's not interested in expressing and revealing the logic of how forces move through it. And of course, a lot of that could have to do with the fact that Venetian foundations are parallel planes instead of perimeter foundations as we would expect in less muddy countries. Like for example this building in Florence, where the heavy stuff is in the bottom and the thin light columns on top. Also the delicacy in the details which occur in the column capitals, the quatrefoils, and other pieces of marble just show the excellence and refinement of execution in this building. Look at the surface, the way the brick gets laid up in the Doge's Palace. This series of diamonds, and it almost seems like it's more interested in pattern making for the sake of pattern making than pattern making to reveal how forces are moving through the building. And just compare that to something like the Colosseum, where the pattern is stacking the column orders, and the columns here are not structural at all, but ornamental. But it lets you logically connect to how the Colosseum is being supported structurally. And the very opposite is going on with the Doge's Palace. In fact, if you had to think of something that looks like the Doge's Palace, it probably wouldn't be architecture. It would probably be something more like a carpet. And even the fringe of a carpet makes you think about the lightness of how it meets the ground, the lightness of how it meets the sky. This unraveling of the solid plane of surface as it comes to its perimeter condition is very much like a textile, especially if you think about this connection with the East that Venice, this maritime culture had, that they're looking at not only palaces or churches in Alexandria, but probably also more vernacular ideas about an architecture that might be more textile-based. Even look at the corner, this is amazing detail. It looks as though two carpets have been woven together. Attached to the Doge's Palace is the Ponte dei Sospiri, the Bridge of Sighs, which connects the new prison to the interrogation rooms of the Doge's palace. The view from the Bridge of Sighs was the last view of Venice that convicts saw before their imprisonment, and that's where its name comes from. St. Mark's Basilica was built in the 11th century following the features of Byzantine architecture. The facade has 5 recessed portals that alternate with large piers. Mosaic panels enriches with color the tympanum of each arch. The facade of St. Mark's is pretty fascinating because it makes explicit use of spoils. Spoils are things that you take away as trophies of your victory over another culture. The Venetians have this great arsenal and this great navy, and they are conquering both sides of the Adriatic Sea. The Venetians are conquering Greece, they are making incursions into Alexandria. They have a lot of successful battles, but for the most part they were authorized crusades because they were going off to the land of people who had not converted to Christianity. But at a certain point the Venetians got so greedy, they basically raided Istanbul. They had raided Constantinople, and they took this quadriga out of the hippodrome there, these 4 bronze horses, and they displayed it right on top of the central portico of the St. Mark's Church. And it has all kinds of things, like look, here are Constantine's sons on one of the corners of the church. The Venetians got those too. And lots of columns of many colored marbles, not only from Constantinople, but also columns from Greek temples, columns from anybody who wasn't guarding their columns well enough, and they are encrusted on the facade. So just like the Venetians imported the stolen body of St. Mark, they're importing stolen elements of architecture. The church has 5 domes, and they were originally lower domes with a lead covering, as was typical in Byzantine architecture, not very different from the dome of Hagia Sophia, just in a much smaller scale. You can see how they originally looked in one of the early mosaics in the interior. But in the mid-13th century, they were covered with outer timber-framed domes to give them a more impressive external profile. St. Mark's Basilica was modeled after one of the most important churches in Constantinople, the Church of the Holy Apostles, a Justinian church that was demolished by the Turks in the 15th century. It was used as a model, not because of its importance, certainly Hagia Sophia was the most important church, but because of its form, because of its typological organization. It gives us one of the first instances of a quincunx. A quincunx is a 5-domed church with a Greek cross plan. So St. Mark's Basilica reprises the same plan type as the Church of the Holy Apostles. It is worthy of note that the square piers which carry the domes are pierced on the ground floor and gallery levels. The gallery arcade connects the piers on either side. The vestibules or narthex wraps around the western arm of the cross, disguising the shape of the plan from the exterior, and it's full of smaller domes with mosaics of scenes from the Old Testament, like the creation, Adam and Eve, Noah's Ark, and the Tower of Babel. There you can also appreciate how detailed the pavement is, with its thousands of tiny pieces of marble perfectly cut to fit together in these patterns. The whole ground floor of the church is richly decorated with these marble patterns on the pavement. The interior is richly veneered with colored marbles casing the lower part of the walls. Above and extending in one great surface over vaults and domes is a lining of richly colored glass mosaic, in which are worked figures of saints mingled with scenes from their lives, set off by a broad background of gold. Mosaic, in fact, is the real and essential decoration of the church, to which all architectural detail is subordinated. So even the idea of the material surface of the interior of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople we see here in St. Mark's, and that is this denial of the material presence of surface in favor of the creation of this luminous field of pattern and ornament. But the decoration is far from homogeneous in character. The mosaics that cover the arches, vaults, and domes range in date from the 12th to the 16th century. Whereas the earlier mosaics perfectly complement the architecture, the style of the latest seems far from appropriate. You can see in this model how they build the vaults by building a wooden framework to support the stones. Now, Byzantine churches from the east are for the most part Orthodox, and even though St. Mark's is Catholic, it will have many features of an Orthodox church because of its Byzantine style. And one of these features is the iconostasis, which is this wall of icons and religious images, separating the nave from the sanctuary. Behind this, there is the tomb of St. Mark. There's a ciborium, which is this covering over the altar with 4 highly detailed columns, and below it, there's the sarcophagus with this Latin inscription. Corpus Divi Marci Evangelistae, which translates as the body of the divine Mark Evangelist. Behind all this is one of the most refined works of Byzantine art, the Palla d'Oro, with both front and rear sides decorated with icons of religious figures. And really entering this building is such a great thing, especially if you go upstairs to the museum part, since the ground floor is a bit too crowded. From this point you can see the interior as a whole as you stand right above the nave, and you can really see up close the detail of the mosaics. Each piece of mosaic is about the size of a fingernail. Up here you can also see the original bronze horses up close and appreciate all the details. They were moved here for better preservation, and the ones placed outside are replicas. In this upper level of the basilica, you can also access the balcony and experience the beautiful view of the two plazas, and analyze how the interlocking space is working. Also from this spot you can see St. Mark's clock tower closely and see the numbers changing. You can observe up close each detail of the facades of St. Mark's and of the Doge's palace. Those two columns over there are the columns of St. Mark and St. Theodore, the patron saints of the city, and they constitute the monumental access to the square for those coming from the sea. Venice is a city of light. In order to appreciate the architecture of Venice, you need to see it at different times of the day and experience all the nuances that it offers. Observe the details of the buildings from different points of view, while keeping in mind that this is a city that's different to any other. Venice is the most visually seductive of all the cities of the world. Walking the city and navigating through its canals is one of the most sublime experiences one can have, for it feels more than any other place like a city that's made to look at. And in my personal opinion, the most beautiful city on earth. Well, on the water actually. If you enjoyed this video, I have a playlist with videos of Italy in my channel, so make sure you go check them out. Thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like, it really helps me. Subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you very soon in another episode. Goodbye.
Porque no es peor que ser tragedia, que ser ciego en... No me acuerdo dónde. Es la salida.